President Bush is touring Africa. For a president whose foreign policy has been defined by Iraq, is the trip a chance to show the more compassionate side of his legacy? And what else is in it for the US? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hashim Ahalbara. It's one part of the world where he can still claim he's popular. President Bush's short tour of 5 prospering African states is meant to highlight how successful US aid programs have been there. In Tanzania, flag-waving crowds had been lined up to greet him. He's also visiting Benin, Rwanda, Ghana and Liberia. Massive spending has made Africa the centerpiece of the Bush administration's aid strategy. It's a far cry from the days when, newly elected to office, Bush said he couldn't picture Africa as part of the national strategic interest. 12 of the 15 recipient countries of Bush's 5-year $15 billion AIDS relief plan are African. Bush wants to double that over the next 5 years, though some Democrats say it's still too little. A 5-year $1.2 billion anti-malaria scheme is said to have reached 25 million Africans. One foreign aid program, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, has approved $5.5 billion worth of development aid to 16 countries, 9 in Africa. The money spent on infrastructure, education and health. Joining us to discuss the latest US presidential tour of Africa are our guests in Washington, D.C., Joel Barkan, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and professor emeritus at the University of Iowa. In London, Cameroon Duodo, African Affairs analyst, and in Dubai, Hamdi Abdurrahman, professor of political science at Cairo University. Welcome, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Joel Barkan in Washington, D.C., a lame duck president visiting 5 prosperous African countries. What kind of impact can he make at this moment?
Well, he really can't make any direct impact at the present moment because, as you suggested, he's at the end of his term. This is meant to be a valedictory trip, with perhaps one significant exception, and that is he's visiting Tanzania and he's sending Secretary Rice to the north, to Nairobi, just a few hundred miles north, where in the wake of a failed election, there was a bitter standoff between President Kibaki and his opponent, Raila Odinga. Negotiations under the mediation effort of Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, have been underway now for almost 3 weeks. They made some progress, but not enough. And by sending Rice there, the Bush hopes to accelerate that process.
All right. Mr. Cameroon Duodo, but don't you think that by selecting just 5 nations, among others, he's just trying to tell the world, look, I'm just trying to be very politically motivated in my approach. I'm looking at 5 nations which have been successful stories, and just let's delay the discussion about the other controversial issues like Somalia, like Kenya, like Chad, like Ethiopia.
Yes, of course, but you can't expect anything else. He wouldn't like to take the risk of going into any country where there is a likelihood that there will be demonstrations against him. And there is cause for disquiet in Africa about American policy in Africa. If you strip it of the rhetoric, let us look at where it is felt most terribly, and that is in Darfur, Sudan. About 500,000 people, some say more, have been killed. The African Union has been there trying to stop these killings. It has, since it went there, and even before, asking the Western countries, asking the Western countries to equip it, not to send troops. President Bush says that he's had to make a tough decision not to send American troops. Nobody wants American troops there. The African troops are there.
Okay, just one aspect. We'll definitely go back to talk about in detail about that. Mr. Abdul Hamid, this is a man, Abdurrahman, sorry, this is a man who has been saying that he wants to bolster democracy in the region. But you look at the picture in Africa, the American response was not that blunt to Mr. Kibaki in Kenya after what happened in the elections. Neither was the same response to a repressive government as described by the media in Ethiopia, which cooperated with the Americans to invade Somalia. Isn't this giving leeway to people to say the Americans talk the talk but don't walk the walk?
Yeah, could you let me first talk about how I see the Mr. Bush trip to Africa? I could read it from a different perspective. From the American perspective, he is the first incumbent American president to visit Africa more than one time. And since Mr. Clinton visited Africa in the late 90s, the last American president visited Africa was Roosevelt when he met with Winston Churchill in Casablanca in an African soil. So if we could look at this development and how the American foreign policy perceive the rising strategic importance of Africa. Now, if I look to President Bush personally, he is seeking a kind of personal glory because he emphasizing on the countries which he is considering a great success stories for him.
Okay.
So he's looking for the president emergency plan. He is trying to fight malaria.
Exactly.
Fight
so
AIDS.
About malaria and the plan to fight malaria and AIDS, and my question is to Mr. Joel Barkan. Is this something that he can proudly say, this is one of my packages that are about to make significant change in Africa, when others are saying that even the pledge for $15 billion or 25 is not enough at all to eradicate AIDS and malaria?
We can always talk about the fact that it's not enough, but I think it's important to put in broader perspective what American policy is all about, or shall I say what the stated policy is, and then we can evaluate whether or not it has succeeded. It's basically had three components. First of all, an emphasis on peace and stability on the continent, ending the civil strife on the continent. And arguably, whether it's occurred because of Bush or not, the number of civil wars in Africa, which numbered about 7 when he came into office, is down to about 2 today. Yes, Darfur is very much still a problem. You have Chad, etc., but places like Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc., Eastern Congo are no longer in the state they were back in 2001. A second, economic development and an economic reform and a move to free market economies. This has been a policy that kicked in at the end of the first Bush administration, that is 41, Bush's father, was continued through the Clinton administration, and George Bush then followed it. So it's not original with him. He's simply continued. And let me just finish one more.
Okay.
And then thirdly, democratization. And you don't hear much about democratization on this trip, but in respect to economic development and stability, to some respects, the president wouldn't say he has bragging rights because he can't claim it's because of him. Let's just say he is visiting countries that have done well, and in terms of highlighting those countries, which you don't hear about very often. You don't hear about Tanzania because things are going well there. And I think it's important for the rest of the world to know, and including the American public, that there are countries doing well in Africa, that it's not just a continent of civil war and strife.
The fight against AIDS, Mr. Judo, is an attempt to burnish his legacy as a compassionate conservative. But don't you think that by being very selective on this, he might alienate other countries that don't share his conservative vision of how to deal with AIDS?
Well, AIDS is a very, very terrible disease. You would have thought that the world would want to go against it with every inch of power that it's got. Instead of which, Mr. Bush wants to preach continence as a means of fighting AIDS. The use of condoms in some cases discouraged. AIDS research could most probably benefit from the use of stem cell technology. Again, Mr. Bush is against that, and he brings that into this extremely devastating disease. So you have to strip the rhetoric of its flourishes and go to the nitty-gritty. And when you get down to the nitty-gritty, I'm afraid it doesn't show very much. We were hearing just now about aid. Now, the basic organization that is pursuing American aid in Africa is the Millennium Challenge Corporation. This corporation has been so slow in using even the amounts that have been given to it in Africa that it's had to be reorganized. And right now,
Mr. Hamdi Abdul Rahman in Dubai, this is a man who has failed in the past to win the hearts and minds of Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East. Do you think he's a popular man in Africa?
No, I couldn't say that. I couldn't say that because Mr. Bush is one of the most unpopular world leader. And even in Africa, if you look at the kind he received in Tanzania, and in many places I traveled and I'm aware about his unpopularity in Africa. You see Mr. Bush, his policy toward Africa became more militarized. He launched it in 2007, the AFRICOM, and look, there is a heavy military presence in Djibouti and the American Navy in the oil-rich Gulf of Guinea. So there is now, we have to put this trip into the broader scramble for Africa. There is a new scramble for Africa, for oil, for natural resources. I could remind you and the audience about the Union speech of Mr. Bush in 2006 when he pledged that he will reduce the American dependence on the Middle East.
Oil will be definitely, Mr. Abdul Rahman, one of the issues we will talk about just after the break. Gentlemen, time for a short break. When we come back, we look at the competition over Africa and ask, does China do a better job helping African development? Stay with us.